Hi everyone, and welcome to another TouchDesigner tutorial. This one's going to be a bit different, where we're not going to create an original network from scratch. We're actually going to recreate the types of ideas that this artist here, Refik Anadol, is using. Now, as a digital artist, whenever I mention this to people that don't know very much about digital art, they always mention the name of this artist. They've likely seen his work at institutions like MoCA, where he takes some form of AI dataset and often visualizes that using some form of flow field in 3D. This is the artist. This is some of the visual aesthetic of his work. And this is the work in motion. And something we can also see about a lot of Refik's work is he always puts in some kind of 3D avatar. Even though these are often also in real space, we can see that there's often a person that's put into the demonstrations. And what we're going to do today is something like this. We're going to do the quickest recreation of a Refik Anadol we can. We're going to put our flow field using some kind of AI data set into a 3D sort of box. And also we're going to have some fun, and we're going to put a little 3D avatar in there as well, if that's going to augment the scene. Let's take a look at what this avatar can do to match with that vein of Refik Anadol. There, he's having a little dance. He really likes the art. He's having a great time. So we're going to create the steps to learn how to do something like this and put it into a 3D scene, and we're going to try and do it as quickly as possible. Let's start the clock. The first thing that we need is some kind of data set of images. I'm going to use this data set of butterfly images that I found on Kaggle, but you can use any sort of selection of images you want. In this case, this is a set that's used for training AI, but it doesn't have to be, because ultimately what we're applying is just an effect. I'm going to start out by making a folder so I can recall all of these images, and I'm going to drag the images into my root folder, and we can now see that all of these have linked. I'll bring this out to a null, and I'm going to call this butterfly. I can access all of these images using a movie file in, and to do this, I'm going to bring up my parameters window. Under file, I'm going to delete this, and I'm going to say op butterfly, and this is going to reference that we're grabbing from here, and then in square brackets I'm just going to say index 1 and then path. So we can see that we now have a way of recalling these images. I want to just link this to an LFO, and it's going to index a count. Let's actually set this to pulse and the frequency to 0.5. And let's just rename this so it's easy. B index, and bring that into a null. And I'll just call this B index 2 just to be easy, and I'll copy that. In this section here, we're going to say int op b index. Guess it didn't copy. And open up the brackets. And again, b index. And close the brackets there. The important thing here is to add in that int, because what we'll find if we don't have that is we're likely to get an error. So just make sure to have that int placed here, just to make sure everything moves nice and smooth. I'm going to bring this out into a fit, and I'm going to scale it to 600 by 600 and fit outside, so we always have a square. And if I was doing this a bit slower, I would make sure this was neater. So now we have our image and it's cycling through. I'm going to convert this into pops. So take a top 2 And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this into a feedback. I'm going to apply a noise. You can see that the noise is starting to do something here. Bring it to a null, and I'm going to drag that null onto the feedback so we can see that everything has become distorted. I'm going to add in a keyboard in, press A to make the viewer active, and reference that on my start. So now every time I press start, it will reset that feedback. In the feedback parameters, I'm going to turn this down to 0.01. And I also don't want to have this fully feeding back all the time. So I'm going to add in a math mix. I'm going to mix between the two inputs, so the regular input and the feeding back input. So I'm going to say P in 1P, and then I'll set a value of like 0.1 or even smaller, 0.01. So then we get something that will somewhat retain its shape. I want some movement in my feedback, so in the translate 4D on the transform page, I'll say abstime.seconds times 0.1. And actually, let's make that even smaller, 0.01. And now we can see there's some very slow movement. We can tweak the parameters of the noise later, but let's stick with this for now. One of the things we can see is that now we aren't getting these color changes. So I'm also going to add in a second math mix, and I'm going to mix my color in the feedback as well. So let's go for color in one color, and let's set a value. And now we can see that the color will change over time. And the larger the amount, the quicker it will transition. So again, let's go for something that's a bit small. Something else I have sort of forgotten to do because we're building this out very quickly is I actually want to add in a sort of a transition effect to this to blur between the images as they develop. And a really simple way I have for creating this transition is to bring this out into a texture 3D. We're going to say have about 100 elements in that texture 3D. Bring that into a time machine, and then very, very simply just drag the image that's feeding in before the texture 3D into our time machine. And it's going to blur between those changes as we move. The blur will take longer if you add more to your cache size, or if you actually add in a blur, that's going to smooth out the effect a little bit. I'm going to just connect this to a null and reference that to my top 2 pop. So now we can see that there should be some more of a meld, and that's obviously incorrect. There should be more of a sort of a development in these color changes over time, and that's looking really nice. Let's bring this up to about 0.5, just so we can see the image a little bit better. Okay, so this is basically that feedback loop, and now what we're going to do is create a box. We're going to turn down the size to 0.1. We're going to just do something so it looks sort of elongated. That's fine, you can choose the orientation, but for me I'm going to have it facing up. I'll plug that into a copy and link that in there. Under template attributes, I'll add in my color. Under template, I'll start playing around with some of these factors as well. So I'm going to add in a few math functions that we can utilize. Let's add in to our math mix. I'm going to grab color, and I'm just going to do an A times B because I want to scale the color down somewhat. So I'll take color, and I just want to get the first value of color, so the color.x multiplied by 0.1, and I'm going to name it C size, and then we won't be affecting our overall color. So C size should now be available to us under point scale. So now we can see I'm scaling my object via C size. You know what? I actually think I want my object to be in this orientation. Great. I might even bring it up a little bit to 0.2. The next thing I'm going to do is I want to rotate, and I want to rotate by my color. So I'm going to add in another multiplication, and I'm going to take my color, but I just want the X, Y, Z, the first 3 values, and I'm going to call it CRAD. And I also want to create a uniform so I can modulate this later called CMult. And let's say 180 so we can actually see the change. So we've got our CMult in there. Now, let's pulse that. And we just want to make sure that we're outputting only 3 values versus the 4 RGBA values. Okay, so now we should be seeing some rotation. Yep, that's looking good. And I'm going to take it one step further. I'm going to turn on this template rotate to vector. And I'm going to say, let's go for our noise. And then you can play with these to get different types of rotation, but I'm going to keep it at Z. You can also flip this around and try different parameters to just change that rotation slightly, but let's stick that with noise right now. And again, what you can do is you can go into this math mix and you can automate how much this is actually going to affect your image. So you could turn that up quite a lot. Okay, so now we have all of these rotations in place. The next thing that I want to do is I'm going to bring that out to a null, and I'm going to start rendering. Let's bring that into a geo. Let's take a render. We're going to grab a camera viewport. We'll link that to the render. Split the screen. Let's take a panel out. And now we should be able to see something, and we will when we actually add in some form of color. PBR, environment light. For the time being, let's just create a noise and drag that onto our environment. I'm also going to create a regular light as well. In the PBR, turn down the metallic and turn down the roughness, and you can kind of tweak that until you have something that you like. Camera viewport, let's go and set this to ... Now we can rotate it. My computer's heating up. I'm also going to open up parent parameters and turn on middle and right buttons for the camera, so now I can move around in space. Okay, looking good. A few more tweaks here. I'm going to play with this box some more, so let's make that a little bit bigger on that axis, so now we can actually see those cubes sort of moving a little bit better. I'm also going to go ahead and reduce the size of this even further from 600 to 400, partly to keep my computer running nicely, but also to make the output a little bit more sparse. Getting some kind of error in our math mix there. CRAD not found, must be created. Okay. In this case, I'll just create a attribute real quick that we can utilize. I wasn't receiving that error earlier, but let's just run with it. CRAD float 3. There we go. Home that. So now we have something that is looking pretty cool. We can amp the the noise a little bit, maybe 0.05 to get something that still keeps its form. We can also play with these mix parameters as well. So the lower this is, the more noisy it's going to be. The higher it is, the more close to the original image it's going to be. So if you have it at 0.4, it's just going to be a bit displaced. So the secret here is really just finding something that works for you. Let's also turn up that transform speed. So it's a little bit faster, a bit more dynamic. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add a frame for this object. And to do that, I'm going to create a box. I'm going to do this all in pops. I'm going to bring this out to a delete, and the goal is to delete a side. Let's look at that in a geo. We'll scale that later. For the box, I want to turn this to primitive in the normals. And under delete, I want to select my entity to primitives. I'm then going to go into this attribute and select this. We want equals. And basically what this is going to do is it's just going to delete a face at a time. And we can just flip until we find the right section. So I'm going to delete N2 on value 1. And we can see it's just deleting that one face, which is really handy for us. We're now in a box. We are exceeding the size of that box a bit though. The next thing I'm going to do is add in a limit. And our box right now is a uniform scale of 1. So let's turn this to 0.5, 0.5 and clamp. Now we are clamped pretty much within the confines of that box. We could make the box a teensy a little bit bigger, just so it's not going to have any bleed on the outside whatsoever. And I'm going to reduce the size of this on the depth as well, just so it looks a little bit cooler. And I'm going to translate that back a bit, probably just like until we start seeing bleed there. Okay. That's looking pretty good to me. The next thing we can do is in this light, turn on shadows. Not looking great at this point, so we're going to go into the light itself and position it. The closer it is, the more realistic those shadows are going to look, and you can sort of play with the positioning on that as well. So just drag that around until you get something that you kind of like. If you have it on a softer light, you can also play with the softness in terms of how you are visualizing that. But let's keep that where it is for now. Again, we can play with some factors like this roughness to get something that looks more or less sort of vibrant in your scene, and playing around with just adding more saturation to the color will also help. Something else I like to do is go from my null here, which is just the point positions before we copy. I'm going to bring that into a delete, and under the thin attribute, I'm going to enable that thin random, so I really reduce the number of points in my scene. Bring that out into a trail. Yeah, it's looking good. And now I'm going to bring that into another geo. Let's do a point sprite on that. I'm going to increase that trail. I'll switch that to frames. I'll increase that trail and I'll just move down that amount very slightly. Even more. And what I'm also going to do is I'm going to attach my keyboard reset to this trail as well for this reset. So when I reset now, we're not going to get these big bumps. We're not going to get these connecting lines. Copy that limit just so we have a limit on the trail output as well. You could always just do a limit at the beginning of the scene as well if that makes it sort of feel like it makes more sense for you. Okay, looking good. And obviously the version I showed you earlier was a bit more refined, but this gives you quite a lot of kind of ideas that you can work with. The next thing that we're going to do is I want to bring in some kind of scene and have it in some kind of space. So I'm going to make a sphere, bring that out to a geo. I'm going to make my sphere real big. So I'm going to just expand that until we can see the edge of the sphere. I'm going to bring in some kind of shape. This is something I downloaded the other day. I'm going to bring in this snowy mountain mesh. We'll have it held down here, and let's just grab the texture as well. Great. Put that into a geo. In the uniform scale, I'm going to make that into something like 10. I'm going to rotate it on the x-axis. Like, what's that, 180 or just 90? If I zoom out, we should be able to see that it's there. And I've flipped it the wrong way, so let's just go and flip that to the opposite, so -90, and move it down. Camera viewport's kind of handy for this, so you can just like check where things are. Okay, that's looking okay. I'm gonna again add a PBR, and right now I've just disabled this sphere from showing. PBR is going to have my texture in the base color map. That also needs to be added. We'll turn down the metallic and the roughness until it's not looking that shiny. Looking very good. And I'll also move this up a little bit so it sort of matches with that, and just arrange so it makes sort of sense based on the positioning. Again, it doesn't have to be like super perfect here because we're just playing around. Move like this. Just arrange whatever scene you use to make it feel like something's kind of fitting. As we saw earlier with Refik Anadol's work, it's really important to have some kind of person looking at the screen. So let's do that. I'm going to grab just any old FBX that I can find, because these also are going to have some kind of animations. Dancing with Drink Mixamo. Let's do hip hop dancing because I think that's a mesh of me. We'll enable that. Yeah, that's me. Pretty bad scan, which I just added a dance to. We're going to go into the parameters on the X form. We'll turn down that uniform scale massively. Love it. We're going to rotate it so I'm looking at the art. We'll move me down. And we'll move me back a little bit. So now we have a tiny dancing person moving with this scene. Can move it down so the feet kind of match with the floor. And he's looking at this art that's sort of evolving before him. Let's go ahead and add that sphere back in. So I'll just take this back on. And now we have our sphere environment. You can see it's there. And it just gives us this sort of like external view to the scene. Got quite harsh shadows, so that's something to play with later. I'm going to bring in a HDR, which I'll use as my texture for the sphere. I've only pretty much got one or two on my computer that I use all the time. We'll update the environment light with that HDR. We can see it's kind of applied some of that already. And onto this sphere, let's just do another PBR. We're using lots of PBRs today. Add that to the geo. Add that as the base color map. Let's turn down the roughness. If we zoom out, you can see it's sort of textured. You get the scene there. And this is basically the effect. You can obviously go in and do things that are going to be more interesting. The little figure is a bit silly, so I would probably just go ahead and turn it off. I would likewise sort of think about moving up my scene, or maybe have a bit more of a traditional gallery scene to make this sort of fit in a little bit better. I'm also going to go in and just make some changes to things like the light. Can go around and just move that to a scene that sort of makes sense to you, quite like that. And then I'm also going to add in just another light. This won't be casting shadows. This will just be a light to brighten the scene. I'll find an angle that sort of works. And I'm going to turn it down a little bit. And there we have it. We have a sort of a Refik Anadol style artwork in the middle of a 3D environment. And we can go and play with this as we like. Something we can do now we've kind of ramped this up is just add in a bit more resolution here. So let's just keep it big. Obviously when I hit home, it's going to zoom out. So we don't want that. Just to note, if you're scaling up, you're also going to be scaling up those sort of particle trails. And what I would do there is I would just make sure that we're ramping that up a little bit, so we don't have quite so many feeding through, and you can really tweak this effect just to have only a very few particles being sort of traced out by those trails. Or you could have it be a bit more intense. Something also that's important to think about is right now we have no image coming in, and this is because we've gone beyond the number of images in our playlist of images. What I'm going to do to fix that is I'm just going to add in a modulo. I'm just going to say modulo op butterfly op open brackets butterfly dot num rows -1, and now it's just going to modulo around whatever the limit of your image sequence is, so that you don't have that kind of error that I just had. And I was confused for a minute why I wasn't seeing anything. I was like, what's going on with my code? Very cool. Now we have our own version of a Refik Anadol data sculpture, and we have placed it in a 3D environment, which is really great. And we've done this very quickly using just pops in TouchDesigner. So you can obviously modify this to your heart's content, put in any images that you want, any AI datasets. Thank you so much for watching, and stay tuned for more videos.